Welcome to another episode of PvP. And today, I'm going to be hosting the show because I wanted to interview Giancarlo on his expertise on property management. Why? These are questions we often get from our clients when we're working on the field. What do we do? How do we hire someone? Because it's such an overwhelming topic, and Giancarlo has a ton of experience in this, figured, let's do it.
And we figured that you guys might be wondering about the fundamentals of property management. So today, I'm going to be the guest on the show, being interviewed by Anthony.
All right, let's get started.
All right, let's do it.
So let's start with a very basic definition of what it is to be a property manager.
So essentially, as a property manager, you're handling the day-to-day operations of the property and the tenants. You see, it's essentially a business. A property manager really is more than just collecting rents. It's making sure that the buildings are up to par, that the clients, which are the tenants, are living up to your standard, and to make sure that your investment, which is real estate, is being profitable.
But why would a landlord go out of his way, invest in a property, then pay someone else to manage that property?
Well, there's plenty of good reasons for that. Some landlords are more hands-off than hands-on, right? Like we talk about this in our program, in our curriculum, the self-assessment portion, where we talk about determining what type of investor you are. Are you a hands-on investor or a hands-off? And those who are hands-off often hire property managers to deal with the real estate investment. Sometimes property owners also live out of town and they'll hire me to take over and manage the day-to-day, right? But then there's also the property owners that want to focus on their 9 to 5, right? Like I work with clients who are heart surgeons, cancer surgeons. If you're a cancer surgeon, you don't have time to deal with tenants and calls about toilets, right? So there's many reasons why a homeowner would hire a property manager.
So now that you're kind of getting into like the intricacies or the issues of being a property owner, what's a very common issue or, complaint you get as a property manager?
Oh, there's a ton of complaints I get as a property manager. I mean, a lot of complaints come around, for example, noisy neighbors, right? And if I'm, managing a 10-unit building and one of my tenants, a tenant in apartment 3, is too noisy and it's disturbing the tenant in apartment 4, I could understand. But I do often manage single-unit condos for out-of-town investors, and they'll complain to me about the tenant next door who is not even part of my unit, not even part of the syndicate's responsibility, really. It's just a whole other owners. And, we get a lot of these noise complaints, which is the most common complaint that we get, that the neighbors are being too noisy. And it comes down to managing people's expectations, right? So we have to manage their expectations, bring them down to make them understand that they do have neighbors within close proximity. Yeah. Unfortunately, in the case of the condo, I'm not responsible for that neighbor, so there's nothing I could do about it, essentially.
So, to me, that seems like a very easy problem for you to solve. What are some instances where you say, oh my God, this is really going to take me, whether it's days or weeks or months to settle? What are some of those problems that you see in your property management business?
A huge problem in my property management business that takes a long time to settle, especially here in Quebec, is unpaid rents. When tenants go delinquent on their rent payments, we unfortunately have to go through the court, and it could be lengthy. Courts could take upwards of 6 months to get a judgment. Once you register a file, it takes 4 to 6 weeks to get your court date. Then you get your court date, it takes another 8 to 10 weeks to get your judgment. And then to do the eviction will take another 2 weeks. So by the time all this happens, the tenant hasn't paid rent in over 6 months, right? And unfortunately, especially here in Quebec, because it's a very tenant-friendly, province, we have to go the long route. And I actually just came from an eviction today before this, where we had to evict somebody from the unit because he hasn't paid rent since October, right? So
in that case, then, is the landlord fully responsible for the lack of rent paid? Does he have any sort of means of recouping that rent?
Well, here in Quebec, once you get a judgment for a tenant who went delinquent on their rent, you could actually pursue them legally and garnish wages, garnish their salaries, even seize things like their bank accounts, their cars, so long as you had all that information. It's a lengthy process. And however, when you get the judgment, you have 10 years to recuperate your funds.
Wow.
Most of the times, landlords, they consider it basically just null, right? Lost money. So the goal of that is to get them out as soon as possible.
Yeah. And what assurances do you give to your property, to your landlords that this is not going to happen again? Like, what is the process you're going through to screen that next tenant or to really get that perfect tenant for your landlord?
It's interesting because I say this all the time whenever I give a speech or whenever I talk on a webinar. Tenant screening, guys, is the most important thing. Do your due diligence. Make sure you do your verifications, your background checks, your employment checks, your credit checks, all the checks possible. And there's ways to weed out the bad tenants. For example, when my team gets an application on a rental unit, we always ask for a $100 credit check deposit. And what this does is it'll weed out the bad tenants who have bad credit, who know they won't pass the verification, but say, hey, let's try anyways, because they're just trying to catch a fish.
Yeah.
Right? So the minute that you charge them $100 for that credit check, they disappear. Right? And that's a huge, starting point.
Huge sign as well.
Huge sign. Huge sign.
So, but tell me something. If you have this really attractive rental and you have, 12 people interested and they're all willing to give you $100 for a credit check, what do you do?
That's a very good one. Essentially, doesn't happen that we have as many as 12. Okay, we usually get 2, 3 max. But essentially, the way our applications are structured is if the tenant is a delinquent tenant with poor credit or rental board history, it's written on the application that if they get refused due to the fact that they have poor credit or at fault of something, they forfeit that $100.
I see.
If I choose, if I get 2 tenants coming at the same time, tenant A, tenant B, and I choose tenant B over tenant A, I reimburse the $100 verification deposit.
I see.
Because I chose a more qualified tenant over the other.
I see. And is this something the landlord pays for, or is this something the management company pays for?
Well, when we rent properties, credit check expenses are all at our charge.
Oh, very nice. So I'm hearing a lot of, we'll say, tenant-related issues. As a property manager, are you also taking care of the general maintenance of the building?
Well, I don't take care of it myself because I'm not that handy, guys, okay? I'm good at handing the people the money to do the job, okay? I'm good at paying the people, for sure. That's as far as my handiness goes. But we have a maintenance team that takes care of that. So, we had our maintenance guy who was on the show in one of our first episodes, Justin, who does security and day-to-day stuff. And he'll do anything from changing hot water tanks, changing heaters, replacing kitchen sinks, replacing vanities, and all that stuff. He takes care of everything for us.
So those are kind of repairs or maintenance in the apartment. What about outside of the apartment building? So we're talking about the brick, the foundation, the roof. Is this something that a property manager would check periodically?
Definitely. When we do our annual inspections, we're looking at the inside and the outside of the apartment. And if we notice that bricks are starting, the mortar and the bricks need to go and, there's a patch that needs to be repointed, we'll put that into the workflow chart for next season, let's say.
I see. And I guess you develop a schedule so that it prevents from really your building deteriorating to the point where it's going to be a huge cost?
That, and we also work with the budget, right?
See.
So there's maintenance that's required because something needs to be fixed, and then there's preventative maintenance. And the preventative maintenance will essentially deteriorate the huge cost. If you fix the problem immediately when it's small versus, letting it go for 5-6 years, and now you got to change the whole side of your building.
Wow. So now I think we covered really inside of the apartment. We covered outside of the building as well. And I know we touched a bit about, right, the issues that you're going to have with tenants that maybe don't pay their delinquent on rent payment or whatnot. When you're in that process of evicting a tenant and going through the court system, who's taking care of that?
The property manager is.
Okay. And now, is the owner involved in this process at all?
So the owner, and in this type of process, the owner is generally we communicate well with the owners. We let them know what's going on. We let them know the steps that we have to take, right? And we don't always have to use forceful evictions, like with a bailiff, with police, with movers. Sometimes it's more of a conversation we could have. Some tenants are more collaborative than others, but the owner is involved in terms of being well communicated and well informed of the entire process. But we're like, for example, in today's eviction, I was the one who went there by myself with my property manager. And we said, okay, time to go. You got to get out. You know, and because this tenant was collaborative, he had emptied the whole unit, minus a couple things, you know, but he had emptied the bulk of the unit, and we had went there and he had left, essentially. Sometimes it's not always like that. Police are involved, bailiffs are involved, locksmiths, movers. Sometimes it could get really, really messy. And there's a whole family involved, unfortunately. Kids, dogs. So, you know, this is really extreme case scenario.
Wow. And if it does get to the point where it's nasty in a sense and they really want to fight you and you're at the tribunal, are you the one representing the owners in that point?
I go to court 100 times a year.
Wow.
I love going to court. It actually makes me feel like a lawyer. It's as close to I get as being a lawyer as possible. And I go, you know, just this month, in fact, I was in court 3 times.
Wow. Okay, good. So maybe, I don't know if you could maybe share some tips of like, right, the essentials of keeping a good tenant, and just talking about how constant turnover, as much as sometimes, you know, some people think, well, it's good if I have turnover because that means that I can optimize the rents. But there are obvious drawbacks. Now, what's the real benefit of keeping these good tenants in?
So I think a benefit of keeping a long-term tenant is that you have someone who's taking care of your property and who is treating your property as if it's their own, because not every tenant does. Right? Like, remember when I bought my first building, how well the tenants took care of that property?
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. They've been there, one tenant's been there 41 years, they're still there. And the other tenant's been there 25 years but the interior condition of the units were phenomenal. Impeccable. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Not every tenant takes care of units like that. Right? And this is why it's really important for the pre-screening process. Here's a good trick that I teach my property managers, guys. When you're showing a rental unit, okay, and you're walking the potential tenant out, walk them to their car. Take a look inside their car and see what that car looks like. If they got Tim Hortons wrappers, McDonald's wrappers, empty cups, empty coffee cups, pizza boxes in the car, it's a pretty good indication of how that person lives inside of a unit. It sounds like a funny thing to do, but walking them to their car, looking inside their car, you get a great sense of what's going on and how they live.
I think that's a great segue to my next section here of, you know, best practices for success. So what are some, like, I don't know, strategies that you and your team implement, whether it's with the tenants, with the landlord, of how to really run a successful building?
Okay, so there's 2 questions here. One about the tenants, one about the landlords. So as property managers, tenants and landlords are both equally our clients.
Yes.
But the strategies are completely different. So when it comes to having a long-term tenant and keeping them happy, you want to make sure that everything is functioning well in their property. You don't want to neglect any potential service calls. So if you get a call to repair something, you want to do that fairly quickly and don't let it drag on. Some landlords, unfortunately, are negligent to their properties. They'll let a small little problem drag on for a year, 2 years, when it'll cost them $100 to fix.
Wow.
Right? So keeping the tenants happy within reason, because we don't want the tenants to think that they could take advantage either.
Of course.
Right? So if a tenant's calling us to say, hey, you know, the range hood fan no longer works, we're going to change it right away. Normal. Right? So that way when they're cooking, it'll exhaust all the smoke, right?
Yeah.
But if a tenant calls me to say, my light's not working, first thing I always ask is, did you change the light bulb? Oftentimes, you know what the answer I get is? No. And I say, try changing the light bulb and then call me back if it still doesn't work. And they say, okay, I'll try. And they never call back. That means they didn't think about changing the light bulb.
Wow.
So if it was up to the tenant, they would have had the property manager or service guy go there to change the light bulb.
Absolutely.
Right? So keeping them well serviced within reason, okay, I think is great. Now, when it comes to landlords, teaching them the ins and outs about a profitable real estate investment is a good one. So where will you get more return on your building? And, some people often think that they'll get a higher return in, let's say, one area versus the other, and it's often not true, right? So when you look at an area to invest, if you're a landlord and you're looking at an area where you're investing, what are you going to look for? People look for parks, schools, public transportation, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Groceries, things like this.
Yeah.
So there's two things I like to coach my landlords for when they're looking to invest in real estate. And these two things are, and I've said it before, maybe not on a podcast episode, but I've said it in a few speeches that I've done on stage. Look for a Walmart and look for a Costco.
Absolutely.
You know why? I know why. Look for a Walmart and a Costco because Walmart and Costco spend millions of dollars on market research.
Yeah.
And the reason they do that before they open a store is because they want to know if there's a need for their products and their essentials. And you could be assured that if there's a Walmart or a Costco in a close proximity of where you're investing, that means that there's a need for their products and the need for their essentials.
Yeah.
And if there's a need for their products and their essentials at Walmart or Costco, that means there's a need for housing.
Yeah.
So your property is going to rent well.
Yeah. And also they predict that there's going to be a boom in that area.
Exactly. Which leads me to another point. I don't know if you've heard of this one before. I actually heard of this one recently and I liked it. The Burger King method.
Okay. I've never heard of this.
You never heard of the Burger King method? All right. Burger King spends minimal dollars on market research. Instead, you know what they do? They open within close proximity to a McDonald's. Right? So they save money on their market research expenses because they know if there's a McDonald's that opens nearby, chances are there's a need for hamburgers. So they open a Burger King. Now, quickly, we live in the same area in the East End. Let's talk about Burger Kings. Where is there one? There's one on Sherbrooke and Langelier, and there's a McDonald's across the street. Right? Montreal North, there's one on Henry Bourassa, and there's a McDonald's in the Walmart.
Yeah.
Right? And then if you look at, for example, Langelier and Jean Talon, when there used to be a Burger King there was a McDonald's in the Walmart too.
Yeah.
Right? The Burger King method is also another smart method that I just learned about myself actually, and I love, and I tell the landlords to think about the Burger King method, which ties into the Walmart and to the Costco.
So I guess what I'm really hearing here is clear communication is key. Whether
100%.
you're speaking to your landlord, whether you're speaking to the tenants, be really clear with them, be proactive also in the communications, make sure everything is understood, make sure you're really proactive as well with whatever repairs need to be done, be transparent with your landowner, and really guide them through this whole investment process, With that being said, do you use any sort of software or tools that help you make your life easier?
Definitely. Guys, there's a ton of software and tools there. Now, if whether you're a property manager or a beginning investor and you have a small portfolio, like for me, that number was 50 doors. I would do it a lot manually. Google Sheets, emails, so on and so forth. As you pass that threshold, you have to automate it, right? So there's a ton of softwares out there. Just to name some, Condo Manager, Building Stack, Buildium. There's a ton of these all-in-one property management softwares that'll handle everything from rent collection to, marketing vacant units to essentially communication where you could just send out, if I have, let's say, 10 different buildings with 10 different tenants in each building, I could send out a communication to one specific building through a software where people will all get a text message and an email stating that they need to move their cars, let's say if we're washing the garage, or that, they all receive the same message simultaneously. So there's a ton of these softwares out there. With that being said, they cost money.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're going to use a software, generally speaking, the average software will cost what? $2,000 to, start up, just $2,000, but then it's $100 per door that you have.
Wow.
So you need to make sure that if you're buying a software, you have the means to buy it.
You have the portfolio as well.
Yeah, the portfolio. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I see. And do you ever come across, we'll say, landlords that tell you, hey, Giancarlo, I've been doing this for 20 years. I have 50 doors. I just can't do it anymore.
All the time.
Yeah. So now, what have you seen is like the number of doors that landlords say, look, I'm done with this. I need to finally hire someone. Because I know in the beginning stages, people, they get really excited. They buy their property. They're saying to themselves, oh my God, I can't wait. This is so fun, you know? And then reality kind of sets in, right? And then you start saying to yourself, what did I get myself into? And then they obviously, they call you for your services. Now, what is typically the number of doors that you see people start converting?
Guys, everybody's different. You know, I have landlords that I work with that own one condo, and I have landlords that I work with that, for example, has 100 condos. Everybody's different. It's about finding out what is your threshold, right? Going back to that self-assessment portfolio, a portion of our curriculum, you know, for example, some of my clients know that even though they have one condo, they don't want to manage it. They don't want to deal with tenants. And then others will say, you know, I can manage up to 10, 20 doors, so on and so forth. Some draw the line at 5. Everybody is different.
And maybe if you don't mind, like maybe sharing a few tips for landowners in specific on how to, I don't know, any extra little tip that they could be utilizing to better run their business. Because at the end of the day, you know, an investment property is a business. It's something you generate cash flow from. It's something that's going to appreciate in value every year. In 20 years, it's going to make you, you know, your $1 million. Like, what are some of the tips that you like to give to landlords? Whether it's in the beginning of a transaction or during the transaction, what's that? Those like top 2-3 things.
I think one thing I really like to tell landlords is it's not about what you buy. It's about the strategy you apply. Because a lot of people think that they're going to buy a property and then instantly make money.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
And you know, depending on where you're investing, that could be the case.
Yeah.
You know, and other markets, you know, especially in Canada, metropolitan markets, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, it's kind of hard to make a cash flow right off the bat. So you need to apply some strategies. It's not about what you buy, it's the strategy you apply. Another tip that I would offer, you know, landlords essentially is, especially if you're managing it yourself, learn to differentiate a business and a job. Because a lot of landlords will spend their time at their buildings every waking minute that they have outside of their 9 to 5, whether they're repainting the staircase or tightening a toilet or swapping out doorknobs, and it becomes a job. And because they're spending all their time outside of their 9 to 5, which is the job that they already have, they forget that this is preventing them by being there every weekend, painting, changing doorknobs, changing this, because they're handy and they're hands-on. This is preventing them from scaling their portfolio.
Absolutely. You're saying they're treating it more, in a sense, as a hobby instead of as a business, and that they should be doing this a lot more transactionally.
Well, let's talk about this for a second. You know, when you buy a business, what type of business are you buying? Now, some people will buy a dry cleaner and then go stick themselves in the dry cleaner, open till close, Monday to Saturday. You didn't buy a business, you just bought a job.
Exactly.
Right? Other people will, for example, buy a different type of business. Could be anything.
Could be a restaurant.
A restaurant that runs itself. Right? Where there's a general manager on the floor, there's a full staff, there's a full waiting staff, full cooks, and they pass by 2 or 3, 4 hours a day just to make sure it's running well and then move on. They don't stay there open to close in the restaurant. So learn to differentiate what a business and what a job is. Because if you're investing in real estate, you need to have the business mindset. You're investing in a portfolio to be running a business, not to have a job, not to be there every free hour that you have fixing something, repairing something, so on and so forth.
The business side of the job should be you taking the time, looking at other investments, finding ways of getting financing, maybe a joint venture, trying to expand that portfolio and making it into a real sustainable business, right?
Exactly.
One other tip that I think I would offer is, because I'm quite on the conservative side, so when I'm thinking about tips to offer landlords, I'm always saying, hey, get a reserve fund. Take a couple $100 a month, put it aside, forget about it, because things happen. Things always happen.
Unexpected expenses.
Exactly. So let's maybe dive into that. What's some of these expenses that come up that are not often foreseen? And maybe your landlords are shocked. They can't believe it. I don't know if you have maybe a story to share or two.
Well, a common one is a tenant that stops paying. Right? So if you own a duplex and one of your tenants stops paying,
50%.
You lose 50% of your rent roll. If you own a single unit condo and that tenant stops paying, you lose 100% of your rent roll.
It's gone.
Landlords often forget that. So that's definitely a common one. After that, things like emergencies, for example, busted pipes, so on and so forth. This could cause a dent. Right? Last year we had floods where half the city had their basement flooded. A lot of people didn't have insurance for that in some of their buildings.
Wow.
Right? So that's an unexpected expense too. So definitely having a reserve fund. And they always say you should keep 10% aside.
10% of what?
Of your revenue.
Of your revenue. That's a great pro tip. So, do you have maybe any other tips to share to get, whether it's, you're finding tenants, whether you're telling landlords, hey, what upgrades could you be doing to get more, of that revenue in?
I got a huge tip to share for anyone who wants to become a real estate investor. All the secrets of being a seasoned real estate investor are actually in my book, The Investor's Edge. Guys, I've combined 10 years of knowledge and firsthand experience and added it all in this book for you to learn how to become a pro real estate investor.
That's awesome. I love that. So kind of just to sum up, the episode, and I think it's really key to get this really down packed, If you're an investor and you're taking this super seriously, you could also manage your own portfolio, right? Let's be realistic, right? You could definitely do it yourself, but treat it like a business. Don't treat it as a job.
Definitely.
Right? And if you get to a certain point where, oh my God, you're overwhelmed with the work, hire a property manager. You'd be surprised how little of a cost it is in comparison to the work you're going to be doing, right? Spend your time in the right places, right? In looking at finding real estate opportunities, investing in great properties, and let the property managers deal with the headaches of the tenants, whether it's legal, whether it's the day-to-day maintenance of the place, the actual whole building maintenance, let them take care of it. So guys, I want to thank you guys for tuning into this episode. We really appreciate you taking the time, sitting here, listening to us. And you know what? You could follow us on the various streaming sites, wherever you're listening to us right now. So it's Spotify, follow us on Instagram,
Apple Podcasts, Facebook. I think we're on TikTok too.
Thank you guys.
Have a good one, everyone.